David Simpson. My wife Dee Simpson and I are birding with David Simpson. She's the presentation and educational person. I'm the person who just talks and talks and talks forever about birds, and she kind of keeps me in line and organizes it and makes it a little bit more presentable to people. So this presentation is mostly organized by her with all the information that I've given to her. But I've done a lot of birding in the state. I was fortunate enough to be born in the state of Florida in Brevard County, right next to Orange County here. It's a great place to be as a naturalist and birder growing up. A lot of good birds throughout this area. I've been living and working in the woods for quite a long time now. Done a lot of jobs all over Florida. I worked for the Park Service for about 12 years. Have a pretty broad informal education in birds and snakes and frogs and land management and the cultural history of Florida, all of which I share with you if you're on a field trip with me, either with a festival or as a private guide. Dee also helps quite a bit with especially with the presentation classes that we do. And she has a blog that she does, Dee at 8 a.m., which you can sign up for and get a post every day about a bird, a bug, a plant, whatever it is that she's found that's interesting. She puts a little poem together to help you learn about it, help you remember it, and just is kind of entertaining. We've taken that blog and turned it into a couple of books that we've printed up, which are also on sale on the website there. So and she's been in Florida for about 20 years now. If you go to the blog, you can hear her story about how she got into spiders and all. I've been talking about birds forever and teaching about birds forever, and it'll seem like that in another couple hours when I'm still talking about birds tonight, actually, probably. So what we're talking about tonight, the specific subject is pelandgic birding, which is a term. It's pelagic birds. For those of you who don't know what pelagic means, that means an animal that spends most of its time away from the site of land, out in the ocean. It's ocean going. Pelandgic is looking at pelagic birds from land. A friend of mine, several of you people probably know Charlie Yule from down in the Fort Myers area. Hopefully you know him. I haven't seen him for a while myself, but he came up with the idea of pelandgic birding, one of those kind of combination words, which is actually my favorite way of seeing pelagic birds. You don't have to get on a boat. You don't have to be out all day. You're bouncing up and down. Had some great experiences on pelagic boating trips, but I still kind of like just standing on the beach and watching the birds from land. So it's a great way to do it. And the best time to do it here in Central Florida is from late August to early December. You can do it any time of year, of course, but that's when the most birds are moving. And it's not just pelagic birds that you see out there, but you'll see swallows coming by. You'll see sometimes shorebirds coming by. We have this interesting thing that happens in Central Florida in the fall. You'll see egrets and herons flying out over the ocean, heading towards the Bahamas and the West Indies for the wintertime. And in the springtime, if you're out, you see the opposite, birds coming back from the Bahamas. So you'll be out there looking out over the ocean, and here comes a flock of snowy egrets or tricolored herons or something like that coming by, just coming in off the ocean or going out over the ocean there. Watching swallows is one of my favorite things to do, and a lot of them use that coastline for navigation, and they just come right down. Barn swallows by the thousands, cliff swallows being their bank swallows, rough-winged swallows. You can really test your swallow identification skills because they just come zipping right by you. And so you got to look for those little subtle differences in wing shape and flight pattern, and whether they got dark throats or not. And if you get a cliff cave type swallow, then you can really scratch your head. I still have trouble with cliff and cave swallows sometimes. You can pretty well assume they're all cliff swallows and probably be right, but you do get cave swallows sometimes later in the season. Raptors, as you get later into the season, particularly towards the latter part of the season, you'll get raptors coming by and some of the ducks. A lot of blue-winged teal come flying by. You'll see merlins out there. You'll see peregrine falcons. You'll start picking up jaegers as you get later in the season. We have a tendency to get parasitic jaegers early and pomerine jaegers later. We'll be going into identification challenges of that a little bit later. As you get more into November, the ducks really starting to pour on, and even the gulls, and the gannets will come down in huge numbers some days. You catch the right day, you may see 1,000+ jaegers going by, and gannets even more sometimes. And really interesting mixed species flocks, because you'll see ducks associating with each other that don't normally associate when they go to land and rest or feed. The strangest was one time, I think I had a flock of about 50 black scoters, which are big chunky sea ducks, big dark sea ducks, and out in front of them was a little tiny green-winged teal was leading the group there. So, but you'll see these mixed species flocks. Ringneck ducks and scaup will drive you crazy as they're flying by, the hundreds out there trying to figure out which is which and how to separate them out. You'll see widgeons and all kinds of neat stuff going by. If you're lucky, you might get something like a long-tailed duck or a golden eye or something like that going by. We've had long-tailed duck once go by. I had common eiders fly by one time, actually. That's happening more and more often. And maybe you might see canvasback and redheads. If you are an avid county lister like me, this can be a great way to add species to your county lists to places like Indian River and St. Lucie County, where we don't have a huge amount of duck habitat, particularly St. Lucie County. This is a great way to add ducks and other things and shorebirds to your county lists. So that's something to think about if you have that sickness like I do. So things that you're going to want to bring. Telescope is really important, a good telescope. Now you can do some of it with binoculars. And in fact, a lot of times I scan initially with binoculars just to see what's out there. But telescope is really a good thing. You want a lens cloth and a squirt bottle, because some of the best days that you're going to be out there, you're going to have a lot of salt spray coming in off the ocean. You want to keep your optics clean, keep that salt off of there so it doesn't eat up your lens coating and the gear itself. Rain gear, if you want to. Sometimes I'll wear rain gear, sometimes a light jacket. Some of the better days that you're going to be out there are going to be a little bit cold because you're going to be on the backside of a cold front. So if you're thin-blooded and Floridian like me, you probably want to bring a jacket along. If you're getting older like me and don't want to tempt fate and get colds, definitely overdress. You can always take layers off if you have to. The resources, the best, hands down, the best resource is the Sea Watching Guide. I think it's part of the I don't have the official name of it here, but it was Cameron Cox, and I can't remember the other guy who did it. They have extensive experience at the Avalon Sea Watch and up at Cape May, New Jersey, where they do a sea watch along with a hawk watch and a lot of other stuff that they do to study the birds up in that area. And so they've seen and figured out, little tricks to identify different species of scoters and the ducks and the swans and the geese. Don't have to worry too much about swans and geese down here, but they see them up there. And it's a really good guide on a good starting point for how to sort out some of these difficult flying bird ID issues that you're going to have when you're out there. Because you're going to find, if you start doing Pelandgic birding, it's a little different, especially when shorebirds come flying by. Trying to identify shorebirds flying by and ducks flying by, it's not the same thing as going down the wildlife drive and seeing them sitting on the water. So it can really throw you, but this guide really helps a lot with a lot of helpful tips on how to identify stuff. And so this is the conditions that we're looking for. This was described. You can kind of figure it out. I highlighted Cape Canaveral and Canaveral National Seashore on here because Canaveral National Seashore, Pelandgic Beach is probably one of the best places, not far from the Orange County area. You can just shoot right across to Titusville and go out to the beach there, get up on a high point. What happens is when you get a high pressure system, one of these cold fronts is coming out and it's moving out off the coast of the Carolinas or somewhere in that area, the winds rotate clockwise around a high pressure system, And when they're coming out of the tundra in Canada there and swinging around, a lot of these birds, jaegers and other things, gannets and all that, will get on those winds and they just ride the winds around. The winds sweep them around and kind of crash them into the northeast coast of Florida there, at which point they move south along the, they don't fly across the, unless the winds are really strong, they just stay along the coastline there. And as the coast goes out, as Cape Canaveral comes out there, the birds just start kind of build up and build up and build up as you get closer to the Cape. Now, ideally, you'd be able to get out on the base there and get out on the actual Cape itself. But the best publicly accessible area is Pelandgic Beach. You can go anywhere, you can go to the north end of Canaveral National Seashore as well. If you go south in the shadow of the Cape, if you will, some of those birds might get a little bit dispersed as they get pushed out by the Cape there, but you can still see stuff. If you're down in Sebastian, Vero Beach, Fort Pierce, and places like that, you'll still see some of the stuff. But the biggest concentrations tend to occur at Pelandgic Beach, where the birds tend to pile up north of the Cape there. But this is kind of the weather pattern that you're looking for with that high pressure system. There's an app called the Windy app, which is really good. You can see on the left-hand side, that's pretty good condition. If you go out there and you've got northeast winds, if you're just looking on the site, you're not looking at the big picture. Both of these situations here, you've got northeast winds if you go and play on the beach and you're thinking, okay, this is great. We got northeast winds. We're going to get all kinds of birds coming down. Well, if you look at what's going on in the northeast on the right-hand side there, there's a low pressure system sitting up there and it's blowing all those birds way out into the Atlantic Ocean there and completely missing us. Is where on the left-hand side, that's what you're looking for, the big arcing winds coming out and moving the birds down into northeast Florida there. So this is the Windy app, which is free. I think there's a paid version of it, but it's a good one for looking at the regional wind conditions and deciding whether you want to make that trek over to Pelandgic Beach that day or not. The picture on the left is more what you're looking for. The picture on the right is the one that kind of fools you. You'll still get birds on a day like that, but you won't get the jaegers numbers of jaegers and things coming off the tundra because those things are getting blown out way out into the Atlantic Ocean out there, where jaegers and things like that are perfectly happy to be. So they'll just stay right out there. They won't get blown up to the shore like they will with the conditions on the left-hand side there. So we'll cover, I'm not going to cover all the potential identification challenges that you're going to get. One of the fun ones for me, because I have, personal experience with this, back in the day, before I went to Texas for the first time, I used to just rack my brains over all these crazy looking immature laughing gulls and try and turn them into Franklin's gulls, which would be a life bird up before 1998 when I went to Texas. There's all this variation, and I'm looking at them. I'm trying to look at the bills and look at the half hood look on them. And when I finally went to Texas, we were looking for Mexican crows, which are now Tamaulipas crows, I think, at the Brownsville dump. And there happened to be a couple Franklin's gulls there, and I was like, I saw them. I'm like, holy cow, those are Franklin's gulls. And I've never seen one in Florida. Now that I actually see one, I realize those are all immature laughing gulls I was struggling with. And the next fall, I actually did find Franklin's gulls in Florida at Jetty Park and Pelandgic Beach. But the differences are actually pretty, even though they're very close, there are some little things that you can learn to separate the two of them. This one here is kind of a classic immature laughing gull that we see in the fall and winter here. Notice how it's very, very dusky looking underneath. It's got a gray nape on the neck. The wingtips are completely dark on this bird. Very dusky. Some of them can be downright sooty looking, but they're all kind of messy and unclean looking. This is another good shot here. This one's starting to actually molt a little bit. This is probably late winter. Look how the tips of the wings are completely black on this one. The bill, there's no half hooded look to this bird. Some laughing gulls can have quite a bit of black on the nape and around the back of the head, but it's never as distinct as in a Franklin's gull. The eyebrows are a lot less bushy on a laughing gull versus a Franklin's gull. A Franklin's gull at this stage of life would have white tips on the primaries and a very distinctive half hood and big bushy eyebrows that kind of connect behind the eye. The bill shape is also different. If you look closely, it may show up better on this one. The top of the bill is kind of a little bit bulbous. It's bigger than the bottom part of the bill there. That's a subtle difference, but one that you can kind of, after a while, once you see Franklin skulls especially, you can kind of notice that difference because well, he's got his bill open. It's not quite as good, but this you see very clean. It's got a white neck on it. It's got little white tips on the primaries there. This is actually a springtime Franklin skull. And this is by Steve Mladen now because I don't have any good Franklin skull pictures. I had to steal some from Steve, who's a Colorado birder extraordinaire, where they see a lot more Franklin skulls out there. The bill is short, is smaller. The bird overall is much more dainty looking. That's something that you pick up over time after looking at a lot of birds. But I like this really distinct half hood, very bushy eyebrows on them. That brown panel on the wing there, those are retained juvenile feathers. When laughing Franklin skulls are in their first winter, when they're juveniles, they're very brown. And then when they molt into that first winter plumage, usually around October or so, they molt in the gray feathers on the back and the wings and the black primaries and the white or gray on the head. But they keep that brown panel on the wings. Those are retained juvenile feathers. And a really good way, if you're looking through a bunch of laughing gulls and you want to find that Franklin skull, look for that brown panel in the wing in combination with the white tips on the primaries. Laughing gulls really never show that. Juvenile laughing gulls have solid black primaries. Franklin gulls always have a little bit, at least a little bit of white tips. So if you're at the dump or if you're at the beach and you've got 1,000 laughing type gulls in front of you, and you want to go through and find that Franklin skull, you don't have to go look at the bill shape and the eyebrows on every single bird. What you want to do is go look for a bird with that brown panel on the wing, indicating that's the first winter bird, and white tips on the primaries. If you find that, you pretty much found your Franklin skull. Because I have literally, I think once or twice, I've found an immature laughing gull in that plumage that's had just barely a little bit of white on the tips of the wings on the primaries there. So if you can find that, most of our Franklin skulls we get here are first winter birds. You do occasionally get adults, and that trick doesn't work with that. But most of the time, that's what you're going to find. So, and we do get Franklin skull in inland areas in the West Coast. You may well find them in Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive or anywhere where laughing gulls accumulate. Look through them. Late October to mid-November is the peak time for that. But this is one of my favorite, ID challenges, just because it drove me crazy for so long before I finally figured it out. You can see that's another young bird. Got the brown panel, got the white tips. See a little bit of black in the tail, but very distinct black half hood on it. Much whiter. Look how much whiter. They're typically a lot whiter underneath. They have that white hind neck. If there's all kinds of mottling and gray underneath, and you have that gray neck, that's going to be a laughing gull. You can really see the small bill on this one too. The bill is much thinner. The head is smaller. You can actually pick them. One of the things that we see in the fall migration is these lines of thousands of laughing gulls going by, and these guys do stand out. Not only are they just smaller, but that white hind neck and the just the different look to them, they really do stand out from the laughing gulls quite a bit. So I've actually picked out Franklin's gulls in flight almost as many times as I've seen them sitting on the beach. So if you like birds in flight, watch those gulls going by. It's really fascinating as a bird nerd like me to watch that. And that's another shot right there. That's probably a second spring bird there. It's got quite a bit of prominent whites and primaries there. You can see a little bit, as an adult, there will be a little bit of white between the gray and the black tips and the gray body. You can see it starting to come in. This is probably a first spring bird here. You can see that white starting to come in. So there will actually be, on an adult laughing gull, the gray goes right to the black tips. And on a Franklin's gull, there's a little band of white before the black tip, between the gray and the black on them. And that really stands out if you're fortunate enough to see an adult Franklin's gull. Most of the adults figure out they're not supposed to be in Florida, and they go through Texas, and we don't see them on their second migration out here. So, and that's a little shot of the immatures close together. You can see See how much cleaner and whiter that Franklin's gull looks versus the laughing gull with the mottling gray and the gray on the neck and all that. And the some laughing gulls show a little bit of a half hood, but never as distinct as this in these Franklin's gulls here. There's also quite a bit more white underneath the wings on a Franklin's gull than there is on the laughing gull. And that really shows out, obviously, in flight quite a bit. So another thing that you'll see if you've been on pelagic trips, these guys, sooty and bridle terns, often show up after hurricanes, but sometimes if there are strong winds, they'll come in. They're both very dark backed, white underneath terns. We sometimes call them tropical terns because they tend to breed down in the tropics and they show up here. There's some interesting little differences between the two of them. You'll notice on this is a nice adult bridle tern. I don't have any good photographs of these. So all these next photos are going to be by Michael Brothers, who hopefully you guys know. If you don't, you really should get to know him. He's a great guy, like world-renowned expert on terns and gulls and all that. He could talk forever on this stuff. I'm just going to give you the highlights of it. Some of the differences that show up on a bridle tern versus a sooty tern. It actually has a little bit of a white neck on this. You're going to drive yourself crazy trying to see that on a boat or even from shore going if you're looking at these things. The thing that I have found most useful, you'll notice how there's a contrast between the wingtips and the rest of the upper parts there. That is pretty consistent in most light conditions. Sooty tern is solid dark on the top. Bridle tern has that contrast between the wingtips and the rest of the body. Even if you can't tell dark and light, you can usually see that contrast. There's differences in the tail pattern as well, and the underside of the wings. We'll go into that a little bit more, but you can see underneath here, this is a bridle tern. You can see both upper and lower part of the wing. You can see on the upper part of the wing, there's dark on the tip and then pale on the inner part of the wing. You can also see how the white extends up into the primaries there. The white lines stick all the way up towards the points there.
So you can use the mouse to point things out if
Oh.
you want to.
My technical advisor says I can use the mouse to point. Yeah. So see how the white goes up into here. Sooty tern would be solid dark on there. And then this is the contrast that I was referring to. The dark on the wingtip and then the pale down in here. That contrast, to me, that's the easiest way to tell because you're not going to get this kind of look very often. A lot of times they're way far out there and it's hard to tell what they are, but the contrast shows up most consistently. And the sooty tern, notice how dark the tips of the wings are. There's really no white projecting up into the point there. It's very dark overall too. And you can see just how solid, there's no contrast. It's just solid dark all the way across the top there. And that shows up in most light conditions. And even in bad light, the contrast will show up and the uniformity will show up on here. They don't have the white collar that bridle terns did when I was first starting to learn these things. I was driving myself crazy trying to see that collar on there. That's really hard to see in the field unless you get a really close look like this. The tail, you might have noticed, let me go back a little bit. Notice how gray the tail is here. Very dark on a sooty tern. When they bank, sometimes you can see that. But this just solid dark. It's dark, much darker overall, and that solid dark with no contrast. That is a really good way to separate sooty tern. And here you can really see it. See how it's paler gray on the back and then dark towards the tip here. This got a little bit bleached out in this photo, and of course you get the white hind neck versus not on there. But just have a solid uniform dark on here and much darker in the tail. Those marks are going to help you more than anything else in separating these things from a distance. When you do get the opportunity to see them this close and this well, take advantage of looking at the differences and the white going behind the eye up in here versus staying in front of the eye for the most part here. The white hind neck, the tail pattern, and everything. There's even differences in the way they fly. Sooty terns tend to be up higher than bridle terns for the most part. Sooty terns rarely sit on anything. So if you are out on a boat and you see one of these type birds and it's sitting on a piece of trash or something, floating debris out there, if it's sitting down there, it's probably a bridle tern. Sooty terns rarely ever do that. Now we got another shot of direct comparison the underside. Look at all the white going up into there versus the dark on here. That can be hard to judge from a distance, but it is a really good mark. That also works well for Caspian terns, Caspian being the sooty in this pair, and royal tern having the white going up into the point on there. So I don't have any pictures of those, but that's the same difference between sooty being like the Caspian tern with a solid dark tip, bridled being like the royal tern with the white protruding up into the primaries in there. The jaegers. Now you can really drive yourself nuts looking at jaegers, and don't feel like you have to identify every jaeger that flies by. I still don't. I've spent a lot of time looking at jaegers, and I still put down jaeger species sometimes, or pomerine / parasitic jaeger on my eBird list, because even with a strong northeast wind, sometimes these jaeger flocks would be a mile or 2 miles offshore, and even with your scope, you can barely see them. The other frustrating thing about jaegers is they tend to fly very low to the water, so they'll get down between wave troughs, so you'll see them, then they disappear, then they come back up, and you get a little bit of a flash of them, and then they disappear again, and then they come back up again. So don't go out there thinking you have to identify every jaeger that goes by. If somebody does say they're doing that, either they're way more experienced than I am, or they're just kind of stretching the ID a little bit. But we have 3 basic species, and most of what you're going to see is going to be pomerine and parasitic jaegers. Pomerines are the big bruisers of the group. They have, the adults will have these nice little tail feathers with the big spoon on the end of it. That's fantastic if you get that. You don't always get that. Sometimes it's an immature bird, but they're big barrel-chested, broad-winged jaegers. And as you start to observe jaegers and you see them more often, and sometimes you don't see mixed flocks of jaegers all that often. Usually if there's a flock of 25 jaegers, they're probably going to be all one species. So if you get 25 jaegers and 4 of them have this, and all the others are about the same size and shape and the same kind of big bill as the other jaegers, you can pretty confidently say they're all pomerine jaegers. You don't, sometimes you might get pomerine and parasitic mixed together. Parasitic is noticeably smaller and more buoyant. One of my more entertaining flocks of jaegers that I saw, probably Pelandgic Beach. It might have been north in the Canaveral National Seashore, but there was about 8 or 9 pomerine jaegers flying along. And when pomerines fly along, when they're migrating, they're just on a mission. They're just going in a straight line, kind of flying along, just bulldozing their way through. Parasitic jaegers kind of bounce around a little bit. They're a bit more buoyant, more gull-like. And so I had this parasitic with a flock of pomerines one time, and he was bouncing up in front of the group and behind the group and bouncing around. You can almost hear him saying, "Come on, guys, let's go, let's go, let's go." And now they're just kind of bulldozing along there. So I had a great comparison in that case of a parasitic that was with the pomerine jaegers. I think he probably eventually gave up on him and went and found a flock of parasitics to go run around with, because he had a completely different flight pattern, a different size and different structure and all that too. Size can sometimes help with birds, particularly seabirds and shorebirds, where they're associating with other species. Jaegers don't always do that unless they're in feeding flocks. So if they're migrating by, a lot of times you only have one species in the group. That's a nice shot. It's another Michael Brothers picture here. A couple of adult pomerine jaegers, that really neat plumage on the yellow and the dark cap there. But you can see the fairly broad wings and broad and barrel-chested kind of look to them. They don't have a narrow-waisted look like parasitic and particularly long-tailed tend to have. Fairly big bill, very broad wings, and of course the spoon-shaped tail feathers there. Now, parasitic jaeger, this happens to be a dark morph one. Colors doesn't help you a whole lot with the jaegers because they all come in dark and light morphs. But look at the little spiky tail feathers sticking out of this one, and he's a smaller build than a pomerine jaeger would be, and not quite as barrel-chested. A little bit much more buoyant in flight. So if you get the little spiky tail feather, little pointed central tail feathers like that, then you know it's a parasitic jaeger, and you can study it and watch it fly and all that. Becoming proficient in jaeger identification and flight is just a matter of experience and persistence. You just have to keep watching them. And when you get an adult and you know what it is because you see those central tail feathers, really study the bird and look at the structure of the bill and the way it flies and the broadness of the wings and all that. Really familiarize yourself with all that so that when you get immature birds, you can make a more educated guess about them. And that's a nice adult. There's much narrower winged. There's little pointy tail feathers in there. This one's a light morph, obviously. but much thinner than a Pomeranian Jaeger would be. Smaller bill overall. Not it's bigger than a long-tailed Jaeger's bill, but much smaller build. So this, you almost never see an adult long-tailed Jaeger here. We were on a pelagic trip with Audubon of Everglades, and it was back in September, I think, of last year. We had an adult long-tailed Jaeger. I saw it flying away from me. I didn't recognize it because it had these 12-foot long 12 inches long streamers sticking out of the back of it. It was flying straight away from me. I didn't recognize it as a Jaeger, but we just don't see adult long-tailed Jaegers very often here in Florida. We do occasionally. But I'm trying to figure out what the heck it is. Thankfully, somebody got a photograph of it, and it was a long-tailed Jaeger. But look how tiny that bill is. A little tiny little head, tiny little bill on them. They typically only have, this is actually a really good mark, these 2 white shafts up here, or maybe a third one. That's about all you see on a long-tailed Jaeger. Most of the other Jaegers, there's a lot more white flash in here. Long-tailed Jaeger, those 2 white shafts in there, that's a darn good mark for long-tailed Jaeger. You're not going to see it very often because you don't see long-tailed Jaegers very often. But if you do see a Jaeger, it's got very distinctly 2 white shafts on the end of the wing, and it's very small and buoyant. Typically, they're not going to have the really long tail feathers like that. They'll be just 2 little spiky tail feathers. Might look a little bit like a parasitic Jaeger, but just tiny little head, tiny little bill, very, very buoyant flight, and the white shafts in the primaries. That's going to be your long tail. I think I've seen long tail from shore maybe twice, and I've only seen them offshore maybe 4 or 5 times. But the size and the structure really will strike you as being different. They almost have a nighthawk like flight. They're so buoyant and dainty. And they're most likely to come in early. August and September is when you're most often going to see those. And that's when parasitics are more common too. Pomeranians tend to be a little bit later. So if you do get out and do a late August, September Pelandgic, you don't get a whole lot of cold fronts at that time, but you can go out there anyways and see what you're going to see out there. That's when you're most likely to get your long-tailed Jaegers. Now, they've been seen in the wintertime as well, in the late fall, so they're not out of the question later in the season, but they do tend to be more common earlier in the season. And then that's more typical of what you're going to see. Again, kind of a small bill, little tiny head, little pigeon-like head. And again, the outer 2 shafts are much more. This one has actually quite a few white, but the very prominent white outer shafts on the primaries there really show up on both sides. I believe both top and bottom. And you see just a little spiky little tail coming out there. Not quite as, that can look a little bit like a parasitic Jaeger in that sense, but very, very dainty, small little Jaeger. And so but the white shafts, like I said, the ones that I have seen, those white shafts are a really good field mark for long-tailed Jaeger. Don't worry, you're probably never going to see one in Florida, but if you ever get that, that's what you're looking for. Oops, there we go. And that's a good example of the 2 extremes there. Pomeranian, big barrel-chested, big bill, big head, big broad wings. Look how skinny this little long-tailed is in here. Little tiny bill, little pigeon head on him. Can't see the shafts too well in this particular picture, but you can really see the structural difference. None of that barrel-chested, big-bellied look that you get on a Pomeranian Jaeger. Very much thinner than the Pomeranian Jaeger. So we're going to go into a few other things. We do see shearwaters offshore sometimes. Shearwaters have this interesting flight pattern where they kind of just they get their wings in kind of a bow shape. They're kind of stiff with droop down at the tips. They kind of go back and forth over the water and shear the water. So they say the wingtips might hit the water and kind of shear the water, hence the name shearwater. They're in the tube nose family, so get close enough to them, they got those little tubes in their nose that squirt the salt out so they can drink salt water and excrete the salt, so they don't have to come to land for fresh water. So the most common one we see out here is the Cory shearwater. They're pretty common from, well, all summer long, and particularly towards, October, November, sometimes you get quite a few of them. They will get blown in pretty close to shore. They're a relatively big shearwater, probably about the size of a herring gull or so, I think. Have that kind of beige, fairly uniform beige look on top and white underneath, and a yellow bill. That's what you mostly see. If you're fortunate enough, you might get, oh, this is the Borealis one. This is the subspecies we see the most commonly. It's got fairly dark tips. Again, we get into the dark tips of the primaries, and it's very, very white underneath overall. We also get the scopales, which nests in a different, I think these nest in the Caribbean. You see the whites going up into the tips there. That's very hard to see in the field. It's often best to get a good camera, a good high-speed camera, and you can get that white in there. This is probably a future split where they're doing more and more studies on pelagic birds and finding out some of these isolated breeding populations are actually not just subspecies, but actually different species. So this may be a future split. So if you're really into listing, you really want, but it can be very hard to see that, especially when the bird's 3 or 4 miles offshore and you're looking at it through the scope as a little speck in the scope. But the other one we see sometimes, and we see this in the springtime when they come by, we get these crashes sometimes where get strong east winds and the Gulf Stream gets blown and the currents get kind of blown apart and the migratory fish scatter, and some of the birds will come ashore, either get blown ashore or get pushed ashore. They're a lot of times they're starving because they're not finding enough food and they get up on the shoreline. So we've seen this occasionally in springtime. We get lots of great shearwaters in close to shore. They're very dark on the back. They're large like a Corey shearwater. They got this kind of capped look on them, the dark cap and the white collar on there. And this one's actually shearing the water, hence the name shearwater there. So that's probably our next most common shearwater. Most of the time when I've seen these from shore, it's actually been in the springtime during those odd times when they're coming ashore. And the Audubon shearwater is another one common. They actually breed in the Bahamas, so we see them offshore fairly often on boat trips. Very different looking, very narrow, long wings. They don't do the arcing flight quite as much. They actually have a very shallow, rapid, fluttery flight. Very black on top, white underneath, short little tail on them. We have, yeah, they're dark up under the tail for the most part here, and a lot of white up under here. They almost looks like a storm petrel here. It's so small. They're very much smaller, very different flight pattern, very narrow wings, and often rapid, shallow wing beats as opposed to the arcing flight that you see on the other shore. And I've seen these from shore occasionally. They may be here all year round. They're like most of the shearwaters are here mostly in the summertime. And sooty shearwater is perhaps the most likely one to be seen from shore. They're not very common. If you've ever been out to California, there are literally millions of these you can see from shore in California. Atlantic Ocean are not nearly as common, but very, very dark, obviously. Very long, narrow wings on them, and a silvery, kind of whitish silvery wing lining on them. There's a number of reports in the springtime. This is when you might see in April and May actually off the coast. They often feed fairly close to shore, so even in non-pelangic ideal conditions, you may still see one of these. They may be within a couple miles of shore. I actually don't have one. I've seen them in a number of different counties, but not Brevard County, my home county. So that kind of annoys me a little bit. But one of these days I'll get out there in the springtime and pick one of those up. And this is a real prize here. The Manx shearwater looks a lot like an Audubon shearwater. Has more broad wings, which takes a lot of practice to see. It has a lot of white underneath the tail, whereas the Audubon's has mostly black up underneath here. The wings are more broad. Separating this out from Audubon's is actually pretty tough to do. You've got to get pretty familiar with the Audubon shearwater and their flight patterns and their wing shape before you necessarily want to tackle this. This has more extensive white underneath as well. That's a field mark we get into quite a bit with a lot of different types of birds. But this one comes from over on the other side of the Atlantic, but we do get them in the wintertime sometimes. So some of those late I have seen one of these, I believe, from shore, if I remember right. At Pelandgic Beach, I saw one time. There's been as many as 4 reported off Canaveral National Seashore before, but this is one in November and December you might see. If you do get a black and white shearwater like that at that time of year, you want to start thinking more in terms of Manx than Audubon's. Again, a good high-speed camera is a good way to get shots of these things and identify them later. That's the way we do it on a lot of these boat trips. These guys got really good cameras and they can pick it up and then we identify it later. So that's a nice little, that's the kind of what you're going to see of a manx shearwater. Look at the extensive white underneath the tail here. The wings are a little bit more broad than a Audubon shearwater. It takes a little bit of practice and familiarity to get with that. With a lot of these birds, that's don't expect to be an expert right away, and don't get too frustrated when you're looking. Just enjoy the fact that you're out there. Learn from an expert. That's a good way to do it. Get somebody to come out there with you, and somebody who does know more about stuff like that. I've learned some stuff from Sir Harry out. I haven't birded with him very often, but I did pick up some things with him. I've learned a lot of stuff from Michael Brothers, Mitchell Harris also. I can help you out sometime if you want to do that sometime in the fall when we get right conditions. I have taken people out and shown people birds before, Pelandgic birds, when the conditions were right. So get with somebody who knows that. A lot of what I know from being around people who knew more about stuff than I did. So a lot of the experts, they learned from other people as well as doing it themselves. So always avail yourself of experts if you can. That's the great thing about being in the Audubon Society, is you can always find somebody who knows more than you about something. I can do it too, even actually. So even when you get up to my level, there'll still be people you're looking up at. So don't worry, enjoy it. Don't expect to be the best birder ever, because it can only be one of those, and it's not me. So okay, the storm-petrels. These will drive you completely nuts. I mean, I still struggle with these a lot. Even people who know the birds fairly well, sometimes if they haven't seen them for a while, it can really kind of drive you nuts. We have mostly 3 species out here. The one you see the most often is the Wilson storm-petrel. They have very paddle-shaped wings and a lot of white. You can see the wings are fairly rounded, kind of paddle-shaped. These guys are about the size of a purple martin. They look huge in this picture, but they're not very big. A lot of white, big, huge white band in the tail. The white goes way up underneath the tail. Those are both really good field marks, and they're the ones that paddle in the water like this most often. You rarely see a leeches or a band rump ever doing something like that. So if you are on a boat, throw some popcorn out, and these guys will come and pick it off. They're like sea pigeons. They'll come and take popcorn out of the back of the boat. I think these days we don't usually do a lot. We actually use chum and oil and stuff like that, but they will follow boats around. If you get out on one of the party boats going out to Cape Canaveral, sometimes you can get the kids rate to go sit on the upper deck and just watch birds out there for half a day. These will often come in the summertime if you get on one of those boat trips. They don't go out real far, but they often do attract some things like that. So it's good practice for seeing these guys and watching them fly, because they will follow the boat for hours sometimes. So you can get tired of looking at them. But knowing that common one like that, that's the way you find the less common species, like a Leach's storm-petrel here. Leach's storm-petrel has extensive white in the tail. They often have these worn panels in the wings here. This is a great picture because this is often what you see, is just kind of a blurry thing going by. The wings are much longer. Notice how it's kind of paddle shaped in here, much longer. They have almost a nighthawk-like flight, the way they kind of fly stiff winged. The white is entirely on the top. It doesn't extend underneath the tail like in the Wilson storm-petrel. That's a good mark to learn how to look for. The panel is actually pretty prevalent. That's worn covert feathers, wing coverts. That is usually in the plumage that we see them here. That's usually pretty prevalent. The tail is notched, and it's fairly prominently notched on them. That can be hard to see, but that's usually a pretty good mark for Leach's storm-petrel. And then that one you can see a little bit better, the notch there. A lot of white on the top. This panel here, this worn panel I was referring to, is often pretty prevalent on leeches. It can be on other species too, but very long pointed wings on these guys, not the round paddle-shaped wings that you see on the Wilson storm-petrels. These guys they kind of zip in and out a lot of times. They don't follow the boat so much. They'll come fly around the boat. So if you're out on a boat trip and you got to watch these things. They'll make a couple circles around the boat and then fly off, so you won't always often get a really good look at them. And the band rump storm petrel is often very dark. It's a little bit more like a Wilson's in that the wings are a little bit more paddle shaped. They do have a band, a very narrow white band, and a squared off tail, if you can see that. But they're very dark, which can be deceptive in the lighting when you're offshore. But these are noticeably darker, more pointed on the wing like a leech's storm petrel. You're probably more likely to. They're kind of in between leeches and Wilson storm petrel in a sense, but they don't usually have a very prominent band or worn covert band on them, and that they have a very clean white band and the little squared off tail. These are the ones that fly a little bit more like a shearwater with the wings curved and arcing back and forth. I remember having one off of St. Lucie County last fall or the fall before, I remember. And that arcing, he's got the wings in the arc right now, so it's a great picture of it there. And they just kind of do that shearwater like arcing flight, as opposed to the nighthawk like flight of the leech's storm petrel, or just the paddle shaped, floppy flight of the kind of pigeon like flight almost of the Wilson storm petrel. These are fairly uncommon, but you do get some. And on a good day in the summer or fall on an offshore trip, you can get all three storm petrels out there. But Wilson's is the most likely one to show up, probably both onshore and offshore. So that's it. I'm not going to go into all the other identification challenges out there. That's probably enough for you for now. So we'll open the floor to questions, I guess, at this point. So.
And I think we did have some comments.
Comments, okay.
Okay.
Do you want to unshare?
Oops, sorry, when Deborah did this, I went backward. Lois had pointed out that she read shearwaters will dive up to 70 meters.
Yeah. I have a hard time doing that off our coast because it doesn't get that deep out there. But yeah, the ones that little bumps on their head, those are the ones that went 70 meters down. But yeah, some of them, some of these things are pretty crazy. Some what they're capable of doing in the pursuit of fish. I like fish, but I'm not going that far deep for a fish.
Terrence Skelton, you were talking about the shearwater, specifically the Manx shearwater, and he was asking that, can you see those birds from cruise ships? Yeah,
cruise ships sometimes can be, depending on where they're going. So once you get out on that ocean out there, the birds are following ocean currents and food sources and stuff. So if the cruise ship goes near an upwelling somewhere where nutrients are coming up and it's bringing the whole ecosystem to the surface there, you can find stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of hit or miss, but if you're on a cruise ship going out over the ocean, you might as well sit up on the deck there. I know when we went out over the Gulf of Alaska on a cruise ship, we had all kinds of, we had albatrosses and shearwaters and all kinds of stuff out there. We don't see as much in the South Atlantic, but yeah, you can see that kind of stuff. One of the advantages of a cruise ship is you're often very high up, so you get a really good long view out over the ocean there. You're actually looking at the tops of the birds a lot of these times, as opposed to looking straight at them. But yeah, depending on where you're going, and especially if you're going over towards the Caribbean, you're going to get closer to things like the black-capped petrels and the Audubon shearwaters and stuff that are breeding over in those areas out there. So that can be a really neat way to see pelagic birds.
Great. Lori says thank you. Terrence says awesome presentation. Mary says great info. Thank you.
Yeah. Try not to get overwhelmed, but it was yeah, this is a very challenging birding thing, but it's a lot of fun. And just don't expect to be an expert at it right away. Just enjoy it and have fun with it. I think it's great because you just see so many different things out there, not just pelagics, but you see ducks going by, you see swallows, you see gulls flying by, egrets. One day I was out there as a coot sitting out in the ocean out there, so you never know what you're going to see out there. So it's a lot of fun. So
any time of day better than another?
Theoretically, yes. Most of the time of day when I've been out there has been early in the morning, but that's probably just somewhat biased because that's when I've always done a lot of my birding. I've had some days where I've gone out in the afternoon, had really good duck flights in the afternoon, actually. So So there could be good flights at any time of day. I don't know for certain that morning is better, but I have often had really good success in the first few hours after daylight and seen a little bit of drop off sometimes. But when birds are flying over the ocean, you know, they don't always have a lot of options to rest, so they just keep flying. So they may well come in at any time of day out there. So
Terrence wanted to know, do you ever see eagles out there?
sometimes there'll be eagles on the beach. A lot of the raptors do follow the migrate because all their food is migrating down the beach, the gulls and the terns and the shorebirds and all that. When I was up, I was doing a job monitoring a beach site up in Flagler Beach, and there was this one young bald eagle was sitting out on a telephone pole in North Peninsula State Park, and it would keep going out and strafing the gulls on the beach. It would go right over top of a flock of gulls and pick one out and chase it way out over the ocean out there and try and grab it. So I don't think very many eagles migrate along the beach along here. I don't see them doing that, but sometimes if their territory is close to the beach, they will come out to the beaches because there's an ample food source there for them, the gulls, the terns that they like to eat. Same reason they go to the dumps. So yes, I see them, but not so much migrating, I don't think. I think they're mostly just birds that are nearby there that take advantage of the pelagic birds going by. So.
What about tropic birds? Do you see
tropic birds? Rarely do you see them from shore, but that would usually be more of a hurricane related thing if you're out ahead of a hurricane or maybe right after a hurricane comes in. But I have the only ones I've ever seen have been out offshore. They're not very common. It is possible to get one. One of the things that when we do see them offshore, they tend to come in really high and come down and circle around the boat and then fly back up and disappear again. So what might happen if you're on the beach, they may be flying up really high. When you're doing pelandgic birding, most of the time you're looking at the horizon. So I may have had tropic birds fly right over top of me and never even noticed because I wasn't looking up. So I guess if you look up every once in a while, you might see them. I wouldn't hold my breath though. Rarely do we ever see tropic birds from shore. We don't see them all that often offshore for that matter.
Yeah. And I think he said he saw one off snakebite / flamingo on a college field trip.
Snakebite flamingo. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. A tropic bird on the snakebite out there. That's interesting. I mean, that you're down close to tropic bird country out there, but I know there's a red-billed tropic bird that visits Pensacola. It's not Pensacola Bay. It's up in Gulf Breeze up there. I forget which bay that is up there in the Western Panhandle. There's a red-billed tropic bird that for a couple of years now has come in and just cruised right through the bay out there. So that is one tropic bird that we've seen from shore on a regular basis out there. Every day it would come through and cruise through that area out there. So occasionally they do come in close to shore like that. But and back in the day, we used to see them before I went to Dry Tortugas back in the 80s and 90s, I think at least into the 80s, white-tailed tropic birds possibly were nesting there at Dry Tortugas, and they were being seen all the time around the fort out there. That's sort of land. It's out in the middle of the ocean out there, but that was one case where you could see tropic birds pretty reliably while standing on a solid surface out there. So.
Yeah, and he said thank you for information about the Gulf Breeze and that he is in Louisiana now.
Okay.
And Lewis says thanks for the presentation.
You're welcome, Lewis.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, this will be on YouTube shortly, at least by tomorrow. So check it out again.
Yeah, this is going to be one you want to check out a few times before you go to the beach. You're going to want to review it.
Thankfully, it's recorded, yeah, so you can take notes and go back and I missed that. So yeah.
Definitely take notes. It's very good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you for this presentation.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Bye.
All right.